welcome everybody to Tevora's webinar, Introduction to HITRUST and Keys to Certification Success. My name is Matt Fullerton. I'm an account manager here at Tevora, and today we'll be hearing from John Huckabee. He's our Managing Director of Cybersecurity and Compliance. If there are any questions, please use the questions function in GoToMeeting, and we will address those at the end of the presentation. Before we get started, just a little background on Tevora. We're a management consultancy focused entirely on information security, compliance, and enterprise risk management. We offer just a huge range of services from security assessments and penetration tests to solution selection and implementation. We can also help if there are any security compliance frameworks that you'd like to align with, like HIPAA, HITRUST, ISO 27001, SOC 1 through 3, PCI, and more. We've been in business for over 16 years, and we work with companies of all sizes, from startups and software tech companies all the way to Fortune 500s. So that's just a little bit of information on who we are here at Tevora. John, why don't you take it away?
Great. Thanks, Matt. Good morning or afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're at in the country. And let's get started. This is Tevora's HITRUST Introduction and Keys to Successful Certification. So Matt had already provided a brief introduction. We're going to be giving an overview of the HITRUST framework, why organizations are seeking certification, how HITRUST is different from the other compliance frameworks. We're going to review the assessment structure, and then most importantly, talk about keys to successful certification. Tevora is an originally approved HITRUST CSF assessor, and as Matt mentioned, we're a provider of multiple information security and compliance service offerings. And as Matt mentioned, I'm a managing director here at Tevora with just a little bit of experience in security and compliance. Now, a little bit of an overview of HITRUST, the organization. HITRUST was founded in 2007, so a relatively newer framework when compared to some of the other frameworks and compliance standards that you may be aware of, whether it's PCI, SOC, et cetera, et cetera. HITRUST didn't start until around 2007, or exactly 2007. Headquartered in Frisco, Texas. I was just there for my third recertification as a HITRUST practitioner. So I was just at the headquarters there in Frisco. They've been there as long as I've known HITRUST, and it's a pretty nice little office they've got there. They're universally recognized. They're the only universally recognized healthcare information security certification. So that's that's a pretty important designation. As you know, for HIPAA, there's really no such thing as a certification for HIPAA. There are attestations that firms provide, but there's really no formal certification that's universally recognized. Although those firms might call it a certification, there's really no recognition of that. And the OCR has come out and directly stated that, actually. And then lastly, HITRUST Alliance is governed by a board of directors made up from leaders throughout the healthcare industry. So that's really an important point as well. The reason why I mentioned that is the framework was really initially designed with the emphasis on the healthcare vertical. No other framework has that. So when you're looking at the HITRUST requirements for a given environment, know that those were chosen to be a part of the greater HITRUST library because of what healthcare leaders thought were important in their environments. So what are the types of organizations seeking HITRUST certification? First and foremost, usually organizations that come to Tevora saying, hey, we need to get certified, it's because one of their business partners, likely a covered entity, but maybe a business associate, is requiring them to be HITRUST certified. And the reason why those companies are requiring them to do that is because they want assurance that they're protecting the data. So that is probably, I would say, the majority of cases, but certainly we have a number of organizations come to Tevora that fall into these other two categories. The first being an organization might be relatively new to information security, and they may be just looking for a comprehensive framework that can help better secure their environment. We run into that fairly often. I wouldn't say it's the majority of our HITRUST clients, but certainly there's a fair percentage that are just looking for a framework that fits what they're looking for as an organization. Lastly, we have, and this is largely in kind of the product, medical device, or startup space, where a newly formed company is looking to have a differentiator in the marketplace. Maybe their competitors aren't HITRUST certified, so they want to be HITRUST certified so that it can help their sales team, frankly. So also, it's a nice benefit to better secure their environment. So we see that as well, particularly in some of the startup hubs like Boston or San Francisco. A lot of newer companies are seeking certification for marketplace differentiators, because the HITRUST brand, being able to associate with the HITRUST brand or certification carries some weight in the healthcare vertical. So some of the differences between HITRUST and other compliance frameworks, first and foremost, MyCSF is the HITRUST online web application that's used to facilitate the HITRUST assessment process. So, you know, that's very different. There are no other compliance frameworks that I'm aware of, and I know pretty much all of them, that are using an online web application to facilitate a certification. So that's pretty interesting. Next, both the HITRUST approved assessor and the entity being assessed are required to interact with MyCSF. So with this online web application, both the company being assessed has responsibilities, as well as the assessor, in this case, Tevora. Obviously, HITRUST will also be interacting with MyCSF throughout the process as well, but we'll get to that. As a result of that structure, HITRUST has a separate fee structure that it charges. So if you're an organization seeking certification, you're going to pay an assessor firm like Tevora to be your third-party assessor. You're also going to have a separate fee to HITRUST to pay for access to the MyCSF application, among some of the other services that HITRUST provides, such as QA of the report, issuance of the report, et cetera, the certification report. So there are fees that will go both to HITRUST as well as the third-party assessor. Next, I wanted to point out that, unlike other frameworks, HITRUST will audit the assessor's work. So on all of Tevora's certification submissions in MyCSF, HITRUST QAs all of that work, and that's the same for every assessor. So unlike SOC or some of the other frameworks where you kind of hear the term quote-unquote rubber stamping, there's really no such thing in the HITRUST world. All of the assessments are QA'd, and HITRUST does that to ensure the quality and maintain the integrity of the certifications. So it's an important distinction. Lastly, HITRUST has a relatively complex scoring methodology for its assessment. It's really more of a maturity model and relatively complex, and we'll get to that. But definitely, unlike, again, almost all other frameworks where controls or requirements are deemed either effective or not effective, HITRUST takes a different percentage-based approach to each of the controls and to other aspects of the framework. Lastly, and this is, again, pretty important, again, unlike other frameworks such as PCI, for example, or even SOC's control objectives and trust service principles, HITRUST has a series of questions that are answered called administrative details and factors, and the answers to those questions determine what an organization's requirement set will be, and all of that's done in the MyCSF application. So what is one organization's requirement set could be very different than another organization's. A health exchange that we recently certified in New York, for example, had over 600 requirements. Most on average have somewhere between 300 to 350, but just know that the requirement set from one organization to another can vary. So it's not as easy as going to someone in another company and saying, hey, can I have those HITRUST requirements? Because yours are likely different than theirs. So those are 6 pretty fundamental differences between HITRUST and other compliance frameworks that you should be aware of. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to submit those into the questions functionality in the GoToWebinar. We'll get to those at the end of the presentation here. So a little bit about how HITRUST is organized. There are 19 domains within the HITRUST MyCSF, and we'll get to what those domains are. Each domain has multiple requirements that are individually scored. Each of those domains require a composite score of 62% for certification. So you start to see how it feels like a maturity model versus a pass-fail type of approach that's typically taken. Each of the requirements scored are against 5 maturity categories, and we'll get to that in the next slide. And the number of those requirements, as I mentioned, can vary greatly. So there's a very structured approach here. Unlike other frameworks where every requirement is required to be passed, in the HITRUST world, you're just required to pass it by domain. So those 19 domains that I'm going to show you require a score of 62, each of them for certification. So let's get to how each requirement is scored. Whether or not there is an effective written policy is 25%. Whether or not there is an effective written procedure is 25%. Whether or not the control has been implemented and operating effectively is 25%. Whether or not you're measuring the outcomes of that control is 15%. And whether or not you're managing against those measurements is 10%. So right out of the gate, if you're not familiar with HITRUST, you'll notice right away, this is how HITRUST is different from the other frameworks. There's no other framework really doing this. Our clients actually like this complexity. It gives them a structured approach to implementing controls. A, write a policy. B, build a process. C, implement it. And then measured and managed, if you have the bandwidth, there are opportunities to do that as well to even further strengthen the control environment. So I will say that the first time you're being certified, almost all organizations focus on those first 3 categories. You can get certified ignoring those last 2, measured and managed. So most of the focus will be on written policy, written procedure, and implementing the control. So that's a little bit about the maturity categories as they're applied to each of the HITRUST requirements. So here are the 19 HITRUST domains. As I mentioned earlier, each of these domains must receive a certain maturity score to be certified. So you can't be okay in 18 of the domains and ignore one of the domains. That won't get you certified. You need to reach that maturity score in all 19 domains. And here are the 19 domains that are highlighted in the HITRUST MyCSF. I'm not going to read them all. And again, reach out to Matt or myself if you're interested in receiving this presentation. I will point out, just to spread some wisdom, some of the more difficult domains for organizations that have already matured information security practice are configuration management. HITRUST expands on configuration management when compared to most typical InfoSec shops. Third-party assurance is a big one. There's a lot of emphasis on third-party assurance, not just in HITRUST, but in the healthcare vertical. So most organizations find themselves doing some additional work for remediation and preparation for certification in third-party assurance. A lot of the other ones you'll see are pretty common to other security frameworks. A little more emphasis on mobile device security and portable media security there at the top than other frameworks. But a lot of these other ones are going to be what you're pretty familiar with as an InfoSec and compliance professional. Wireless security, endpoint protection, education, training and awareness, risk management, incident management, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all concepts that you're probably already familiar with and that your organization may have already addressed. We do have some organizations, again, they're startups, they don't know anything about any of this. And of course, Tevora can start from ground zero on each of these as well. So, all companies come in all shapes and sizes seeking certification. Some are in a good spot with respect to all 19 of these domains. Some are starting from ground zero and need help with all 19. We've worked with all types of clients. Really, no one, they present different challenges, but all of those challenges are overcome. Tevora is HITRUST certified 100% of its clients, so we're pretty proud of that mark. Okay, let's go to the next slide here. Talk a little bit about Tevora's HITRUST methodology. Pretty straightforward. You'll see this applied to other frameworks as well. We come in and we perform a gap assessment. We think that that's the most critical phase of the engagement. Understanding A, what your requirements are, but B, also where your gaps are at with respect to those requirements is crucially important. As the leader of our practice, I make sure we have an experienced senior HITRUST consultant leading those gap assessments because it's the most critical. As the managing director of our practice, I oversee all of those gap assessments as well to ensure that we have things like scope identified appropriately, but also just to ensure the success of the gap assessment. It's actually we've actually built a pretty efficient model. We'll finish the gap assessment in about 3 to 4 weeks. So from the time that we begin to the time that you'll have that report in hand, it's only 3 to 4 weeks. So you'll know exactly where you stand within HITRUST within short order. So pretty cost effective, and our clients love the gap assessment. We get nothing but rave reviews. Another thing we throw in during the gap assessment is an executive summary. That is something that can be shared with the C-suite or a board of directors that kind of demonstrates where your organization is currently at with the gap with respect to compliance with or getting certified with HITRUST and complying with the requirements, but also what are the next steps. So it's really kind of a true executive summary. The next phase is remediation. Now, the duration of the remediation of those gaps, that can vary. I would say on average, it's probably somewhere about 3 to 4 months, but that's on average. We see some organizations that were very well prepared get through remediation in a month. We see other organizations that maybe they have some conflicting priorities that might take them 9 months to get to their remediation. But really, remediation is really the process of addressing those gaps that were identified in the gap assessment. And again, this is where I believe Tevora stands out from its competition. We work hand in hand with our clients throughout the remediation period on a time and material basis. So whatever support that you need during that remediation phase, we'll provide it. If you need policy templates and language, we can provide that. If you need written procedure examples, we provide that. If you need advice and guidance on how to implement controls, we certainly provide all of that, and we provide a lot of that actually in the gap assessment deliverable. But if you need expanded guidance or maybe new situations arise, maybe you're adopting a new cloud environment, et cetera, we provide all of that continued support during the remediation. So again, definitely I believe where Tevora stands out, and I think that that's why our clients retain Tevora as their assessor 100%. We've never had a client leave Tevora, but also why we're able to successfully certify all of our clients, because we help with remediation. There are a lot of assessor firms that just aren't very good at that or won't do it at all. We pride ourselves on being very good at that. So once we've gotten through the remediation, HITRUST requires a 90-day period to demonstrate that the newly implemented policies, procedures, and controls are operating effectively. So just food for thought when you're putting together a timeline for your organization, 90 days from the time that your remediation is completed before you can start the validated assessment. And again, in the HITRUST world, the validated assessment is the certification audit or the audit for certification. So between that remediation era and that validated assessment era, there's 90 days there. The validated assessment is what you would think of as a typical audit. The major difference being, as I previously mentioned, you're interacting with MyCSF, and we're uploading a lot of scoring and evidence into MyCSF. It's actually pretty labor intensive on the assessor side. That's why you'll see assessors charge a fair amount of money for the validated assessment. There's a lot of work that goes into it. You can imagine we're assessing 300 requirements we're evaluating each of those 300 requirements by those 5 maturity categories. So as many as 1,500 separate scores that are manually entered into the HITRUST MyCSF. And then we're providing evidence for all 300 of those, testing of all those requirements to demonstrate that they're operating effectively. So the validated assessment is a fair amount of work for the assessor, but we typically, again, our guys are pros. They do HITRUST full-time for a living, and they can typically get through a validated assessment in under 4 weeks. Typically, we quote 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the complexity of your environment. Once we've submitted the assessment to HITRUST, their quoted SLA is 6 to 8 weeks for HITRUST to perform its QA on Tevora, and then also to eventually issue the report. There are a couple of other mechanical steps in there, but just know that the validated assessment is kind of a 2-step process. 1, the assessor submits the assessment to HITRUST, and then 2, HITRUST does its processing on the back end to eventually issue the report. So that's a little bit about the methodology and the timeline. Let's get to the sweet spot of this webinar, which I think are the keys to successful certification. 1, use an experienced HITRUST CSF assessor. Now, if you go, there are a lot of CSF assessor firms out there, but not all of them have the experience of HITRUST. Over 1,000 individuals have attended this webinar alone, just to kind of give you a feel for the popularity of Tevora's services in HITRUST, something we're very proud of. Use an experienced assessor. There are some assessor firms out there that kind of do HITRUST as a sideshow, if you will. This is one of our core practices. We have dedicated professionals that only do HITRUST. That's the type of team that you're looking for, because HITRUST is too complex to use somebody who sort of knows HITRUST. You need someone that knows it forward and backward. Next, be aware of HITRUST version updates, timelines, and control population variations. I mentioned this earlier, but HITRUST is a dynamic requirement and library set, control set. So HITRUST updates on average, it's each of its versions. We're currently on version 9.2, but HITRUST updates each version 8, 9, 10, et cetera, on average about twice. Straight from HITRUST headquarters a couple of weeks ago, it looks like there's going to be a version 9.3 update later this year. And then next year, version 10, the long-awaited version 10 will be coming out. But just know that every time HITRUST updates its versions, it impacts the control populations. So what your requirements might have been 3 years ago are very different than what your requirements would be today. HITRUST is taking data points such as most recent breaches and root cause analysis and which controls would have prevented that breach. They're taking that information and integrating it into the framework to make sure you've got an up-to-date framework that is timely and is addressing the information security demands in the marketplace. So just know that there are some moving targets with versions. Now, there's grandfathering into prior versions and mechanisms for that. But for now, just be aware that there are version updates and they can impact your control populations. I would say next, get your requirements established accurately and as soon as possible. When you're dealing with 300 requirements, I think it goes without saying you want to know what those requirements are and you want to start working towards those. So food for thought, if you've got a deadline of maybe you're trying to get certified in 2020, it doesn't hurt to understand what your requirements are today. Again, those requirement sets may be updated with some of the version updates coming out, but typically the version updates, you won't see a huge delta, but by and large, you'll get a good feel for what your requirements will be. So just food for thought on what we've seen successful companies do. Our advice is to purchase the annual MyCSF subscription. HITRUST gives you a couple of different purchase options when you're purchasing services from HITRUST for certification. There are really 2 basic options. One, a subscription that gives you year-round access and some enhanced reporting functionality, among other bells and whistles. The other option, which can save you some money, is to buy a single report object, but it expires after 90 days. The 90-day expiration can can potentially provide some issues for your organization. So our general advice is, if your organization can afford it, purchase the annual MyCSF subscription. Again, that is just a level of access to the HITRUST MyCSF. Next, we want to talk about the assignment of requirement owners. So you have 300 requirements that we've determined apply to your organization's HITRUST environment. Assign individuals to own those requirements, to oversee the implementation of those requirements, or to be the steward of those controls. Kind of project management 101, but it's definitely something that should be pointed out. Again, with the number of requirements in HITRUST, you want to have effective project management. Kind of the first step in doing that is assigning a particular owner to each of those requirements. Now, we have some organizations that are literally 5 employees to the startup, and it's the same person that owns all the requirements. That's fine. Just know that if you're a medium-sized or larger organization, assigning requirement owners helps divide responsibility and is one of those key attributes we see in organizations that efficiently navigate the HITRUST process. Document all of your procedures and policies. So earlier in that maturity category slide, I pointed out that policies were 25%, processes worth another 25%. That's 50% of your score. You only need a greater than 62% score by each domain to be certified. So just by writing policies and procedures, you're over 2/3 of the way there. So just make sure that you're doing appropriately documenting policies and procedures the HITRUST way. HITRUST has some pretty prescriptive things that they're looking for in their policies and procedures. Certainly Tevora can help you out with that. But just know that you're going to want to put a lot of emphasis on appropriately documenting policies and procedures. Next, establish a strategy by domain. As I've mentioned several times, only a score of 62% is required for each domain. So that means you don't need 100%. That you don't even need an 80%. You just need a greater than 62% technically. So put a strategy together. There may be some requirements in a domain that are just too difficult to attain. So you may choose to punt, if you will, on some of the requirements and focus on those requirements that are more realistic for your environment. But just know that having a strategy by domain is important to ensure that you have the scores required for certification. Of course, with Tevora, we are very well versed in this. We know which controls are difficult to comply with versus which ones that are easier to put in place and get operating effectively, essentially. So we'll help you out with that strategy. Keep your requirement set limited to the minimum possible the first year. So we have some organizations, there are a lot of optional requirements that you can have, usually in the form of regulatory factors. So what's an example of a regulatory factor is the PCI data security standard. Or another example might be the MARS-E framework, which is sometimes required. But just know that if you have the option of adding requirements to your requirement set versus not adding, we recommend the first time not adding. HITRUST is enough to chew off the first time. Having 300 to 350 requirements is difficult enough. You don't want to make it 500 requirements if you don't have to. I think that's kind of goes without saying, but just know that the organizations that we see that are successful kind of limit that requirement set up front, and then perhaps they're adding on those regulatory factors in year 2 or year 3 or 4, et cetera, et cetera. But if your goal is to be certified sooner than later, try to limit those requirements to the minimum necessary on the outset. Now let's go to this last one. Use Tevora to both help prepare your organization for certification. As I said, I mentioned a number of Tevora's differentiators. 100% client retention. That's not a sales pitch. That is a true fact. You won't find an organization that ever did HITRUST with Tevora and left. And we're extraordinarily proud of that. And we think that speaks volumes use Tevora. We'll get you certified successfully. All right. So our value proposition, policy templates, procedure examples, we provide those nearly free of charge, strategic remediation, executive summary, solution provider, high level of customer satisfaction. We value relationships. We've retained 100% of our HITRUST clients. And of course, experience. I was at the HITRUST research training in Frisco, Texas last week, or a couple of weeks ago. I was the only person in the room that had been to the course 3 times. We are the most experienced, or one of the most experienced HITRUST assessor shops, and that makes a difference. Okay, there's a picture of me. There's my email address if you'd like to contact me. If you have any requests for this webinar, we're actually going to put it on Tevora.com as well, so you can see it there as well. Let's move on to the questions portion of the presentation. So I'll hand it back over to Matt. Matt, do we have any questions today?
Yeah, John, a couple of questions came through. Thank you. The first one here, can we purchase the MyCSS subscription without going through the validated assessment, mainly to use as a resource to move towards the certification?
Absolutely. So you can purchase the MyCSS just to kind of use it as a resource to see what requirements are in the library. You can tinker around with the factors to see how that impacts your requirement set. I will say that having an experienced assessor kind of show you around is very, very useful. There are a lot of tips and tricks that, of course, our assessors who are in the MyCSS every day, that we just know innately from having worked with it for years and years. Also, when you're answering questions like admin details and factors to determine what your requirement set are, odds are you're going to answer those incorrectly. And I would say probably 95% of the time, organizations that have come to us that have purchased a subscription that try to determine the requirement set on their own, they answered some of those administrative details and factors incorrectly, and they were working off the wrong requirement set. So having an experienced assessor help you determine what your requirements are accurately are very important. Now, that being said, if you're not as concerned about the accuracy of your requirement set, you just want to get familiar with the framework, you want to see the library of controls, certainly please reach out to HITRUST and talk to them about purchasing a subscription and tell them John sent you. Okay, what do we have next?
Next, how long is the HITRUST certification valid for?
Good question. So the HITRUST certification is valid from the time that you submit for certification. We call that the submission. You'll receive the report a few months later, but just know the report date will be when we submitted to HITRUST, actually. So that's an interesting nuance that most folks don't know. So that's the start date. Now, a year from then, you're required to perform an interim assessment. So that's not a full assessment. That's really a spot check is what I like to call it. HITRUST will randomly select one requirement from each of the 19 domains that are required to be retested. And then we're also required to follow up on corrective action plans that were issued as a result of the first certification. So those are a couple of the activities that result in the interim assessment. It's much less work. It's much less expensive all the way around. But there is some light activity a year from the certification date. And then 1 year from the interim assessment, you'll be required to achieve full recertification again. So to answer the question, it lasts for 2 years, but that's under the assumption that you perform the interim assessment a year later. So year 1, receive the certification, year 2, interim assessment, year 3, full recertification. What's next, Matt?
Great, thank you, John. Yep. Last question here. I know you kind of went through the timing, but just in total, how long does it take for an organization to get certified? And that's our last
Yeah,
question.
it varies. Yeah, it varies from organization to organization. We've got a very good streamlined process, and if you call Tevora, we set up an exploratory call, a sales call. We'll be able to ask questions and provide with a good degree of accuracy how long the journey will be for you. But we typically quote 9 to 12 months. Some organizations can get it done in 7 months. That's aggressive, but it's doable. Most organizations fall kind of in that 9 to 12 month range. So that's on average what we quote. But again, organizations come in all shapes and sizes. The organizations that are closer to 7 months are typically smaller organizations or organizations that have already been working on HITRUST or have very mature information security practices. The organizations that are 12 months, they might be larger, more complex environments with lots of data environments. You know, they may have a little bit more red tape in terms of getting policies and procedures approved, that sort of thing. You can see there are a number of factors, some of which I just mentioned, that can impact that timeline. But I would say 7 to 12 months, that's literally about 90% of our clients fall into that range.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Anything else, Matt?
No, those were all of today's questions.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank everybody for attending. Reach out to myself at that email address if you have any questions or concerns. Also go to Tevora.com. We have a HITRUST page. We have a HIPAA page. We have a page for almost any compliance framework out there. So just get to know Tevora and reach out to myself or Matt directly, and we'll get you set up. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.